There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has no name. It's not anger. It's not sadness exactly. It's the feeling of having given everything, your time, your attention, your patience, and slowly realizing none of it moved them. And the most disorienting part isn't the pain. It's the silence inside you that keeps asking, how did I get here? Here's something human psychology has known for a long time, but almost nobody applies to their own life. People do not value what is always available. Not because they're cruel, not because they're broken, but because of the way the human mind processes certainty. When something is guaranteed, truly, reliably, always there guaranteed, the brain stops registering it as significant. It gets filed away. Background, invisible. It's the same mechanism that makes you stop noticing the hum of an air conditioner after 20 minutes in a room. And this is where something quietly devastating happens to people who are genuinely good partners, good friends, good colleagues. They show up, consistently, completely. And over time, the person they're showing up for stops feeling the weight of that presence, not out of malice, but out of simple psychological habituation. The mind labels them guaranteed. And the guaranteed things in life, we stop appreciating. But here's what most people never notice about this dynamic. It doesn't begin with a dramatic moment. There's no single conversation, no obvious turning point. It starts with something small, a plan that gets canceled without much thought, a comment that lands wrong and gets swallowed, a pattern, one person giving more, the other taking without awareness, that slowly becomes the architecture of the whole relationship. And in each of those small moments, a message gets sent. Not in words, in behavior. There are no consequences here. Not because anyone decided that consciously, but because the human nervous system is always reading the environment, always calculating, what can I take without losing? What space has been offered to me? We expand into the space we're given. All of us. It's not a character flaw. It's how we're built. So what happens when someone stops being available? Not as a tactic, but genuinely. First, silence. And the silence feels unbearable at first. Every instinct says to reach out, explain, reconnect. But something else is happening on the other side of that silence. The human mind cannot tolerate an open loop. When someone who was always there suddenly isn't. The brain fixates. Where did they go? What changed? Did I lose something? That sudden, uncomfortable awareness is the first moment real value gets assigned. Not because of a game being played, but because absence, for the first time, makes the presence feel real. You cannot create that awareness by explaining yourself more clearly. You cannot manufacture it through patience or effort or one more conversation. It only arrives through absence. But this is where most people misunderstand what's actually happening, and it's the most important part. The point isn't whether they come back. The point is what happens to you while you're gone. When someone stops organizing their entire inner life around a person who stopped valuing them, something returns. Quietly. A kind of self-recognition. A voice they'd stopped hearing. There's a very specific erosion that happens inside long-term dynamics where one person is undervalued. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, that person starts to disappear. They calibrate their mood to the other person's mood. They check their phone before they check in with themselves. They lose track of what they actually want, what they actually think, what they actually enjoy, independent of what the other person wants, thinks, enjoys. They become a satellite orbiting someone who doesn't even realize they're circling. And this is where the confusion begins. Because from the outside, it looks like loyalty. It looks like love. And in many ways it is. But underneath the loyalty, there's often something else running. A much older pattern that most people never trace back to its source. Psychologists call it repetition compulsion. The unconscious drive to recreate the emotional conditions of early relationships, not because they were good, but because they are familiar. Familiar to the nervous system reads as safe, even when the familiarity is painful. Even when the pattern is exhausting, the body has a map for this territory. It knows how to navigate inconsistent love, earned affection, the feeling of never quite knowing where you stand. What it doesn't know how to navigate, what actually feels dangerous to the nervous system, is love that arrives without conditions, stability that doesn't come with a threat of withdrawal, a relationship where there's nothing to chase, nothing to prove, so someone stable appears, someone genuinely consistent and available, and instead of relaxing, something pulls back. It finds reasons to doubt. It feels suffocated by the reliability. And then, almost like a compass needle returning to north, it finds its way back to the old familiar feeling, the slight imbalance, the uncertainty, the need to work for something, and it gets called chemistry. But what's actually happening is recognition, the recognition of a wound that never fully healed, expressing itself as desire. This is the second layer, the one that lives beneath the question of, why doesn't this person value me? The real question, the one that changes everything when answered honestly, is why did I accept less than I knew I deserved, for as long as I did? It doesn't look dramatic, but it changes everything, because the answer to that question almost always leads back to the same place. A gap. A significant, quiet gap between the value someone intellectually knows they have and the value they actually demonstrate through their choices. They know they deserve consistency. They accept unpredictability. They know they deserve honesty. They tolerate ambiguity. And every time someone overrides their own knowing, every time they stay past the point they already understood something was wrong, they send a message to their own nervous system. My clarity doesn't matter. My limits are negotiable. My worth is something other people get to decide. A boundary without consequences isn't a boundary, it's a preference. And preferences people will cross, not out of cruelty but because the human mind is always unconsciously testing for edges. Real change, not the performative kind, not the go quiet for 3 days and check for a reaction kind. Real change begins with a single internal decision. Not a decision about them, a decision about the operating system underneath everything. I will stop acting from fear, not from the fear of losing someone, not from the fear of being alone, or being too much, or asking for more than they'll give. Acting instead from values, from an honest inventory of what's actually needed and what's genuinely being offered. When that shift happens, even slightly, communication changes. The hints stop. The clarity arrives. The same words delivered from a different internal foundation produce entirely different results, because people aren't just hearing what's said, they're registering what's underneath it. They feel, on a primal level, whether it's real. And here's what actually happens when the work is real. Some people come back. They feel the change, not just the absence, but the quality of the absence. Something shifted that they can't quite name, and it prompts the reflection that was never happening before. They show up differently, and if the inner work was genuine, it becomes possible to tell the difference. Someone who actually grew versus someone who simply found the discomfort of the silence greater than the effort of returning. That distinction matters. One is a foundation. The other is just another chapter of the same story. Some people don't come back. And as painful as that is, it's information. It's the clearest possible answer to a question that was consuming enormous amounts of energy. It removes the ambiguity that was quietly exhausting everything. It creates space. The things that rebuild a self aren't dramatic either, returning to an interest that got quietly abandoned. Spending time with people who existed before this relationship consumed the calendar. Sitting alone long enough to hear original thoughts again, not filtered through someone else's preferences, not calibrated to someone else's moods. These aren't coping mechanisms. They're reconstruction. And a genuinely reconstructed self, grounded, growing, interested in its own life, carries something that cannot be performed. Something that people register immediately, even if they can't name it. Not the performance of confidence, not the strategy of being less available, just wholeness. The people who are most consistently valued, in relationships, in work, in every domain of life, are not the ones who are most accommodating, not the ones who are most afraid to lose. They're the ones who developed slowly and through difficulty an unshakable relationship with their own worth, who hold standards, not coldly, not rigidly, but with a quiet, warm clarity that doesn't require anyone else's confirmation. That's what lives on the other side of this. Not a strategy, not a technique, just a life that no longer needs to ask certain questions, because the answer is already being lived. And when that becomes real, something fundamental shifts. Not in how others see you, in how clearly you see yourself.